In April of 1971, somewhere in the middle of Wisconsin, a woman strapped herself into a fiberglass shell sitting on top of a purpose-built tube frame chassis, lit off a 481 cubic inch Chrysler Hemi pumping nitromethane through a supercharger that had no business being bolted to anything that drove on public roads, and she sent that thing down a quarter-mile at speeds that would have terrified most experienced drag racers at the time. She had no sponsor. She had no team manager. Her pit crew was her own children. And within a few years, the world would forget she ever existed. For 30 years, Nelly Goins was a ghost in the drag racing record books, a woman who went 215 miles per hour on Nitro in the early 1970s and then disappeared completely into the silence of a sport that only remembered the people who showed up on the national circuit with corporate logos on the side of their cars. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the stories that drag racing forgot to tell. If you're someone who loves the history of motorsport and wants to understand what was actually happening in American racing beyond the highlights reel, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing. The drag racing world in 1971 was not one world. It was two. There was the NHRA national circuit, the one that generated magazine coverage and sponsor deals and official timing records and championship points and the kind of institutional memory that turns drivers into legends. And then there was the match race circuit, the parallel universe of regional tracks and booked appearances and gate receipts, where the cars were just as fast and the racing was just as real, but where nobody was keeping score in any way that lasted beyond the weekend. Don Prudhomme was winning on the national circuit with Hot Wheels logos on his car and becoming one of the most recognizable names in American motorsport. And somewhere on a drag strip in the Midwest, Otis and Nelly Goins were paying for their own fuel and fixing their own car and going faster than almost anyone had reason to expect from a self-funded family operation running without a single corporate dollar behind them. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but if she was really that fast and really that significant, why didn't anyone notice at the time? And that is exactly the right question to ask, because the answer tells you everything about how the drag racing world actually worked, and honestly still works, in terms of who gets remembered and who gets swallowed by history. The match race circuit didn't generate the documentation that the NHRA national events did. No official timing books. No championship standings. No national media presence beyond whatever local coverage a track could pull together for a given weekend. You could run 215 miles per hour on Nitro in front of a packed grandstand in Indiana in 1971 and leave zero permanent trace in any archive that a researcher would go looking through 40 years later. That's not an edge case. That's how the system worked. Here's what most people don't realize about the economics of drag racing in this era. The Mattel Hot Wheels deal with Prudhomme and Tom McEwen in 1970 was genuinely transformational. According to reporting in National Dragster and later covered extensively in motorsport histories, that deal brought serious corporate money into the sport for the first time in a way that created a visible divide between the professional touring operations and everyone else. Before that deal, the gap between the top-funded teams and the self-funded regional operators was significant but not yet stratospheric. After it, the professional teams started pulling away in terms of resources, testing time, parts availability, and most importantly, media visibility. Corporate sponsors needed media visibility to justify their investment, which meant they supported teams that ran nationals, which meant those teams got more coverage, which meant more sponsors wanted in, which meant the gap kept widening. The Goins family was on the wrong side of that divide from the start, not because they weren't competitive, but because the circuit they operated on was structurally invisible to the people writing checks. Look, Otis Goins knew what he was doing when he built this car. He wasn't a hobbyist tinkering on weekends with a vague dream about going fast. He was a man who had been following drag racing obsessively for years, who read National Dragster cover to cover, who had saved money from his U.S. Steel paycheck over years of double shifts, and who had reached out to people like Don Garlits and Don Prudhomme for actual technical advice and gotten it. He commissioned a purpose-built chassis from Lee Austin. He consulted Ken Hirata, who had been a championship tuner at the NHRA US Nationals, which is the biggest event in the sport. He sourced Venolia pistons and BRC connecting rods and a Keith Black crankshaft and a Crower Glide clutch and a 2-speed Lenco transmission. This was not a man throwing parts at a project and hoping for the best. This was someone who understood exactly what a competitive nitro funny car required and went about acquiring it methodically on a budget that would have been considered impossibly thin by the professional teams of the era. The car cost approximately $18,000 to build in 1970 and 1971 money. No outside funding, no sponsor, just a U.S. Steel paycheck and a munitions plant salary from a woman commuting 60 miles each way to Joliet, Illinois to help build 105mm howitzer shells for the Vietnam War. Let that sit for a second. The same hands that were supervising the assembly of artillery ammunition during the week were the hands working on a nitro funny car chassis in a garage in Gary, Indiana on the weekends. That's the actual context for this story, and you don't get a clear picture of what Nelly Goins accomplished without understanding where the money and the labor actually came from. The family was Otis, Nelly, and 4 kids ranging from roughly 5 to 12 years old when the Mustang Mach 1 version of the Conqueror made its debut on August 29, 1971 at US 30 Dragway in Hobart, Indiana. Those kids were the pit crew. Nelly was explicit about this in every interview she gave. They were well behaved because they were strictly raised and they worked. Winter preparation for the next season meant lying on cold concrete in a Gary garage, because that's where the car was and the car needed to be ready. There was one friend of Otis's and one of Nelly's co-workers filling out the rest of the crew. That was it. No tire specialist. No dedicated tuner beyond what Hirata could provide when he came down to help with a problem. No logistics coordinator. A family from a steel town running a nitro funny car on the match race circuit and solving every mechanical problem that came up with the people they had available. This is where it gets really interesting because Otis Goins had diabetes. He had it for years, and it was serious enough that when it came time to pursue a competition license, he couldn't pass the physical examination. The illness that would eventually take his life in 2001 closed the door on his ability to drive before the project ever really got started. So he asked Nelly to drive instead. And Nelly has been completely straightforward about this in every interview she has ever given. She said drag racing was not her first passion. She said she did it for her husband and her family. She called it the family dream, and she meant it literally. This was not her individual ambition being expressed through a marriage. This was a shared project where her role was to get in the car because Otis couldn't, and she was the one he trusted to do it. You can read that however you want in terms of what it says about the dynamics of a marriage in 1969 and about the expectations placed on women in that era. But what is not in question is that she actually did it, and that she did it for 6 years, and that she did it at power levels and speeds that scared people who had been doing this their whole lives. The first car was a 1968 Plymouth Barracuda running in B/FC class, injected alcohol, already a serious machine but not yet at the extreme end of what the funny car world offered. The name on the car was the Goins and Goins Conqueror, and that name tells you exactly how Otis thought about the whole operation. This was a family endeavor. The name said so out loud. The first time Nelly actually drove the Barracuda, they tested it on an abandoned airstrip near Gary. That's what you did when you were self-funding an operation with no track time budget and no sponsor connections to call for favors. You found an empty piece of pavement and you figured it out. And Nelly's account of that first run is one of the best things in this entire story. She said she had no respect at all for the car the first time she got in it. Neither of them had ever actually driven one. They didn't really know what to expect. And she was so relaxed about the whole thing that when she got on the throttle, Her head snapped back hard, and she immediately understood that this was not anything like what she had been imagining. She found respect for the car pretty quickly. That's an understatement delivered without any drama, and it is exactly how someone who actually went through it would describe the experience. There's no performance in that description. There's no manufactured excitement. Just the flat, honest account of a woman who thought she knew what she was getting into and found out in about half a second that she did not. They spent roughly a year working the Midwest alcohol match race circuit with the Barracuda, getting comfortable with the car and the routine of running events and dealing with whatever broke, and then loading everything back up and doing it again the following weekend. And then Otis made the decision to go to nitromethane. Now, understand what that transition actually means, because it is not a casual upgrade. Nitromethane changes everything about how a funny car behaves. It changes the tuning requirements, the maintenance intervals, the fire risk, the mechanical stress on every single component in the drivetrain, and the consequences of getting the combination wrong. Alcohol is unforgiving. Nitro is in a different category of unforgiving entirely. The reason professional teams employed dedicated nitro tuners and paid them very well was because the knowledge required to run a nitro engine reliably and safely was genuinely specialized and genuinely hard to acquire. Getting it wrong didn't just mean a bad run. It meant engine explosions, fires, and in the worst cases, situations that ended careers and sometimes lives. Otis wasn't deterred. He had been doing his homework the way he did everything, methodically and seriously, and he had found Ken Hirata. Hirata lived about 30 miles from Gary in Lowell, Indiana, and he was not a marginal figure in the drag racing world. He had been a championship tuner at the NHRA US Nationals, which is the most prestigious event in the sport, and he understood nitro engines at a level that most teams operating at the Goins budget level simply did not have access to. Nelly described him as someone they called whenever they hit a problem they couldn't solve on their own, and he would come down and help them work through it. That kind of relationship was genuinely invaluable for a self-funded family team trying to run a fuel car in a world where competitive operations had full-time mechanical staff and sponsorship budgets that made the Goins operation look microscopic by comparison. Hirata became Otis's technical lifeline through the nitro transition and remained connected to the project for decades. He is the same man who later rebuilt the engine for Rick Lucas's restoration of the car, which is a detail we will get back to because it matters enormously for understanding how this story eventually came back around. Beyond Hirata, Otis reached out to people who had no obligation to help him at all. He consulted Don Garlits. He consulted Don Prudhomme. And those are not names you drop casually in a conversation about drag racing history. Garlits was arguably the greatest top fuel driver in the history of the sport, a man who had literally redesigned the physical layout of dragsters after a catastrophic transmission explosion in 1970 at the US Nationals, and who had won national championships across multiple decades. Prudhomme was in the middle of becoming the dominant funny car driver of the 1970s, a four-time NHRA funny car champion whose name was synonymous with the class. The idea of Otis Goins calling these men for advice and actually getting substantive responses says something real about how the drag racing world operated in that era. It was still a time when you could walk up to someone at a race and have a genuine conversation and get real technical information, because the shared passion for the machinery was bigger than whatever competitive advantage you might be protecting. That culture of openness was real, and Otis used it. And then there's the story of the first time they fired up the nitro engine, which I need you to hear because it is perfect and also completely believable. They did it in their garage. The property was surrounded by churches. And when they finally lit off a supercharged nitromethane engine for the first time, it was right in the middle of Sunday services. Nelly said, and I'm quoting here, "You have absolutely no idea how many cops and preachers showed up. If you have ever heard what a nitro engine sounds like at idle, let alone at any meaningful throttle position, You understand why this is funny. A nitro funny car engine at idle sounds like the mechanical expression of a natural disaster. It is loud in a way that goes past loud and becomes something closer to physical. Hearing one go off unexpectedly in a residential garage during Sunday church services in a neighborhood full of people who did not know what was coming would have been genuinely alarming in a way that required an immediate response. Multiple responses, apparently. The Barracuda body eventually gave way to a 1970 Dodge Challenger shell, which moved the car into A over FC class. Injected nitro. And that is where the learning curve got significantly steeper. At US 30 Dragway in Hobart, Indiana, which had become the Goins family's home track, the Challenger body got damaged early on because they hadn't accounted for tire growth. Here's the thing about nitro funny cars that most people who haven't spent time around them don't fully grasp. When the car launches hard and the tires load up under the force of the acceleration, the tires actually grow in diameter. They inflate under load. And if the clearances between the tires and the body aren't built with that growth factored in, the tires will physically contact the body during the run. Nelly described looking over during a pass and seeing nothing but daylight on the right side of the car where the body was supposed to be. She said they were clearly strictly amateurs, and she said it without any embarrassment because that's exactly what they were, and there is nothing wrong with being an amateur who figures things out through direct experience rather than prior knowledge. The learning curve on a nitro funny car is steep, and it costs you something every time you climb it. The Challenger was a stepping stone. What Otis was working toward was the real machine. In early 1970, he commissioned Lee Austin to build a purpose-built tube frame chassis. And there is a photograph in the Automotive Hall of Fame's collection dated February of 1970 showing Nelly being fit-tested in the chassis while it was still sitting on the jig. The car was literally being built around her measurements. That is how proper race cars were constructed. And the fact that Otis had someone custom building him a chassis rather than modifying an existing piece shows the level of seriousness he had reached by this point in the project. This was not improvisation. This was intention. The body that went on top of that frame was a fiberglass limited 1971 Ford Mustang Mach 1 shell, and the car debuted on August 29, 1971 at US 30 Dragway in injected nitro trim. But the final and most significant version of what the Conqueror became was an AA over FC machine. That is the top of the funny car classification. Supercharged nitromethane. The same category that the professional touring operations were running. The engine was a 481 cubic inch Chrysler Hemi topped with a 6-71 supercharger, which is a Roots-type positive displacement blower that originated on two-stroke Detroit diesel truck engines and got adopted by drag racers because it was robust and capable of surviving the extreme conditions of nitro combustion. The rotating assembly included Venolia pistons, BRC connecting rods, a Keith Black crankshaft, iron Chrysler cylinder heads, a Glide clutch, a 2-speed Lenco transmission, and a full-floater Oldsmobile rear end. At its competitive peak, the Mustang Mach 1 Conqueror was running in the low 7-second range at around 215 miles per hour. That is the number that gave Nelly her nickname. 215 miles per hour in a nitro funny car in the early 1970s on a Midwestern match race circuit with no sponsor and a crew that consisted of her own children and 2 other adults is a number that demands to be taken seriously regardless of any other context you put around it. The African American Automotive Association Hall of Fame specifically identifies April 11, 1971 at Great Lakes Dragway in Union Grove, Wisconsin as the date and location where Nelly first drove a nitro funny car, making her the first African-American woman to do so. That specific date doesn't appear consistently across all available sources, so treat it as unverified but not contradicted. It is plausible and no other source offers a competing date for the same milestone. Now you have to understand what the funny car world actually looked like in 1971, because it matters enormously for understanding where the Goins family fit into it and what they were actually up against. The class had transformed completely from its origins in the early to mid-1960s, when factory drag teams started running altered wheelbase versions of production Mopars and Fords, and the cars looked so strange compared to stock that fans started calling them funny cars. The name stuck even after the cars stopped having any meaningful connection to their production origins. By 1971, what you had instead were full-tube chassis machines under fiberglass flip-top bodies that bore only cosmetic resemblance to anything you could buy at a dealership. They ran nitro. They ran blowers. They made somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 horsepower at a time when the most powerful street cars in the country were making maybe 450 horsepower on a good day, and that gap was only going to widen as the professional teams got better at extracting power from the combination. To put that in terms that land properly, the Conqueror was producing roughly 3 to 4 times the power of the strongest production car available to American consumers at the same moment in history. And Nelly Goins was driving it with her kids in the pits. The dominant driver in the class was Don Prudhomme, who would go on to win 4 consecutive NHRA Funny Car Championships from 1975 through 1978, but who was already the most respected name in the sport by the early 70s. Tom McEwen was his counterpart and rival. Don Schumacher was racing. The Ram Chargers were still active. Ed McCulloch was making a name for himself. And critically, for the purposes of understanding the economic context the Goins family was operating in, 1970 was the year Prudhomme and McEwen secured their deal with Mattel Hot Wheels, which marked the moment corporate America began to genuinely understand that drag racing fans represented a real and reachable consumer market. That deal transformed the economics of the professional level of the sport in ways that were immediately visible and permanently consequential. Created a template for what a sponsored drag racing operation looked like, and it established the NHRA national circuit as the venue where that sponsorship made economic sense. Teams that ran nationals got visibility. Visibility attracted sponsors. Sponsors funded better equipment and more testing. Better equipment and more testing produced better results. Better results generated more coverage. And the cycle reinforced itself every single season. Here's what most people don't realize when they look at this era. That cycle was already well established by the time the Goins family debuted the Mach 1 in August of 1971. The match race circuit wasn't being actively excluded from the sponsorship economy. It was simply structurally invisible to it. A corporate marketing department making decisions about where to put their logo needed metrics they could point to, and the match race circuit didn't generate those metrics. No national broadcast. No consistent print coverage in the major enthusiast publications. No championship standings that a press release could reference. The Goins family could have run every weekend for 6 years and gone faster than anyone expected and done everything right in terms of building and maintaining a competitive car, and the sponsorship phone still wouldn't ring, because the infrastructure that connected performance to visibility to money simply didn't extend to where they were competing. That's not a conspiracy. It's a structural problem, and structural problems are in some ways harder to address than intentional ones because there's no single decision to reverse. Look, the institutional resistance to women in drag racing during this period was not subtle or implied. It was explicit and it was documented. In August of 1967, NHRA Executive Director Jack Hart sent letters revoking the supercharged competition licenses of Barbara Hamilton, Paula Murphy, and 2 other women with a note stating that from that point forward no women would be allowed to drive in any class except stock, super stock, and street eliminator. No explanation beyond the category restriction. No hearing. No process. Just a letter saying you're out. Paula Murphy filed a class action lawsuit. Her sponsor STP applied corporate pressure. All 4 licenses were reinstated in January of 1968. Shirley Muldowney received her competition license at the same time. Della Woods had her AA over FC license separately pulled with the explanation that it was too dangerous for a woman to run in that class, which at least had the clarifying effect of confirming that the NHRA's position was not about safety in any general sense but specifically about women in the top categories of competition. The institutional message was consistent across multiple incidents. Women were tolerated at the lower levels and actively resisted at the upper ones. This was the landscape Nelly Goins was entering in 1969 when she first got in the Barracuda. And she was entering it not just as a woman but as a black woman in a sport that had its own complicated history with race. Women had preceded her in Nitro funny cars. Paula Murphy had been licensed for Nitro and funny car competition since 1966 and had driven the famous Miss STP Mustang and broken 200 miles per hour, and she was a legitimate pioneer in the space. Della Woods had raced at the national level and would eventually reach the 5-second bracket at speeds over 240 miles per hour, which is a genuinely elite performance by any measure. Shirley Muldowney was transitioning into funny cars around 1971 and would go on to dominate Top Fuel in a way that made her one of the most celebrated figures in the history of the sport. So the specific claim that Nelly was the first woman in funny car is not accurate, and she wasn't presenting herself that way. The specific claim that stands up to scrutiny is that she was the first person who was simultaneously female and African American to drive funny cars at this level. That intersection, female and black, was the barrier she crossed that nobody else had crossed before her. On the race side, black drivers had preceded her as well. Malcolm Durham was considered drag racing's first black superstar, and his influence on the sport in the 1960s was real and documented. His contemporaries, and those who followed in his path, had established that black drivers could compete at the highest levels of the sport. So again, the specific intersection of race and gender was what made Nelly's position genuinely novel. She wasn't the first woman, and she wasn't the first black driver. She was the first person who was both, and she was doing it in the most extreme class the funny car world offered at the time. Now, what makes this worth noting at length is not to diminish what she did by surrounding it with qualifications. Running a self-funded AA over FC funny car at 215 miles per hour is extraordinary on its own terms regardless of any demographic context you put around it. But because the most interesting and most honest part of her story has nothing to do with firsts and everything to do with how she did it and what it actually cost and why the world forgot about it for 30 years. Here's the thing about the match race economy that the Conqueror operated in. It was viable and real. There were legitimate racers making names for themselves on the regional circuit who never ran a national event and who built genuine reputations within the communities that followed those tracks. The gates were real. The prize money was real. The competition was real. But it didn't generate the media coverage, and it didn't build the sponsorship relationships, and if you operated entirely within it for your entire career, you could run 215 miles per hour in a nitro car and have almost nobody outside your immediate regional area know your name within a decade of your last race. The institutional memory of drag racing ran through the NHRA national circuit and the publications that covered it, and anything that didn't pass through those channels was at serious risk of being lost entirely when the people who had witnessed it personally were no longer around to tell the story. This is where it gets really interesting because there was one moment when the institutional invisibility should have broken. In November of 1971, Ebony magazine ran a 5-page spread on the Goins family with professional photography and a detailed account of the operation. Ebony was not a niche publication. It was one of the most widely read magazines in the country with a circulation that reached millions of readers across the United States. The headline was Nitro Nellie, Lady Drag Racer Pits Persistence and Guts Against Racing's Best. That is not a buried sidebar in the back of the book. That is a featured story with real estate and real photography in a publication with genuine national reach. Nelly had actually written an article herself and sent it to Ebony, and they rejected the written piece but sent their own reporter and photographer to a match race at Tri-State Raceway in Ohio and produced the story themselves. The photos showed the car and the family and the fire suppression system and the full scope of the operation. And no sponsor ever called. Not one. The national media exposure was there and the corporate response was complete silence. That silence is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something important about how the sponsorship world of 1971 actually functioned in relation to black athletes and black-operated teams. The drag racing sponsorship economy was almost entirely oriented around the NHRA national circuit, and teams that didn't run nationals were essentially invisible to corporate America regardless of their media coverage. But there is also a harder truth underneath that structural explanation, which is that the brands investing in drag racing in 1971 were making decisions about who they wanted associated with their products, and a black family from Gary, Indiana running a self-funded Nitro funny car on the Midwest match race circuit was not the image those brands were building toward. That's not a comfortable thing to say plainly, but the evidence supports it. The ebony feature reached a massive audience. The photography was professional. The story was compelling. The performance was legitimate. And the phone didn't ring. You can construct a purely structural explanation for that outcome if you want to, and the structural explanation is real and partially accurate. But the structural explanation doesn't fully account for why teams with far less impressive credentials and far less media exposure were finding sponsorship during the same period while the Goins family operation remained entirely self-funded through its entire competitive life. Now, you might be thinking that maybe the match race circuit was simply too far outside the mainstream drag racing world for sponsors to take seriously even with magazine coverage, and that is a fair point as far as it goes. The sponsors investing in drag racing wanted the NHRA national circuit because that's where the concentrated media attention was, and a regional operation, however fast and however well documented, was always going to struggle to make the case for national brand investment. That's true. But it doesn't explain why no regional sponsors emerged either. US 30 Dragway in Hobart was a real track with real gates and real local business relationships, and the Goins family were regulars there for years. Local and regional sponsorship of match race teams was not uncommon in this era. Businesses that wanted visibility in front of the audiences those tracks drew found it to be a reasonable investment. And yet the Conqueror ran without any of it, which suggests that the barriers the Goins family faced were not purely about the structural limitations of the match race circuit, but also about something more specific to who they were and what they represented. The racing itself continued regardless. The Challenger gave way to the Mach 1 configuration, and the Mach 1 became the car that defined the competitive peak of the Conqueror's career. The combination was legitimate at the top level of the funny car class. A 481 cubic inch Chrysler Hemi with a 6-71 supercharger running nitromethane produces power in quantities that are genuinely difficult to conceptualize if your frame of reference is production car engines. The specific numbers vary depending on the tuning state and the nitro percentage, but the range for this class and era was between 1,500 and 2,000 horsepower at a time when a 500 horsepower street car was considered extraordinary. The Conqueror glide clutch was a sophisticated piece of equipment designed to manage how that power reached the rear wheels during the launch, which is the most critical moment in a quarter-mile run and the moment most likely to result in a catastrophic failure if the tuning isn't right. The 2-speed Lenco transmission was the standard choice for serious fuel cars of the era because of its strength and its ability to handle the rotational loads that a nitro engine imposes on the drivetrain. Every component in this car was chosen with real knowledge of what the application demanded. The Goins family ran the Mach 1 on the Midwest match race circuit for several years, and the results were consistent enough to establish Nelly as a legitimate competitor in the class. Here's what the racing life actually looked like on a practical week-to-week basis. Otis managed the tuning and the logistics from the ground, which meant he was the one making the decisions about jetting and timing and clutch adjustment and all the other variables that determined whether the car ran cleanly or blew up on the starting line. Nelly drove. The kids worked. The one friend and the one coworker filled in whatever gaps were left. After each race weekend, they loaded everything back up and drove it back to Gary and started preparing for the next event. The winter months meant garage work in northern Indiana, which is not an abstract description of mild inconvenience. Gary in January is genuinely brutal in the way that only industrial cities on the southern shore of Lake Michigan can be, and working on a race car in an unheated garage in those conditions requires a specific kind of commitment that most people who talk about passion projects have never actually tested themselves against. And through all of it, Ken Hirata remained available. When something came up that Otis couldn't solve from his own knowledge and the resources he had on hand, Hirata would come down and work through it with him. That relationship was the technical safety net that made the whole operation viable at the level it was operating. Without a championship-level tuner available as a resource, the transition to Nitro and then to the supercharged AA over FC combination would have been significantly more difficult and significantly more dangerous. Hirata's involvement wasn't charity. He genuinely respected what Otis was trying to do, and he contributed his expertise because the project deserved it. That kind of mentor relationship shows up repeatedly in the history of self-funded racing operations that manage to punch above their weight, and it is almost always the difference between a team that figures it out and one that doesn't. The end of the competitive career came at Bristol Dragway in Tennessee. A tire left the racing surface, and the resulting contact damaged the chassis and destroyed the 1971 Mach 1 body. Bristol is a real drag strip with a real reputation in the drag racing world, and losing control of a nitro funny car at speed is not a minor incident that you walk away from and shake off and move on from without consequence. It is the kind of event that reorients your understanding of what the car is capable of doing when things go wrong, and it costs you the equipment that took years of double shifts and careful saving to build and maintain. Otis ordered a replacement Chevrolet Monza body because the plan was to repair the car and continue racing. He still believed in the project. The dream had not ended just because the body had. But his diabetes had worsened to the point where managing the team's finances and logistics was becoming genuinely impossible, and the gap between the plan to continue and the physical and financial capacity to execute that plan kept widening. The 1975 season is the last year where any documented racing activity can be confirmed. After that, the car went into the garage. The Monza body went on the chassis. And the competitive career of the Goins and Goins Conqueror was over, though nobody announced it as such and Otis never accepted it as final. This is where it gets really interesting in a way that is also genuinely heartbreaking. Otis kept ordering parts from catalogs. He kept reading National Dragster from his bed as his health declined. He never stopped talking about getting the car back out. The dream that had started with a man who loved drag racing too much to let his diabetes be the end of it, the dream that had put his wife in a nitro funny car because he couldn't pass the physical himself, the dream that had kept 4 kids lying on cold concrete in a Gary garage through Indiana winters, that dream didn't disappear when the racing stopped. It just became something that existed in the future tense permanently, always about to happen, always one more part order away from becoming real again. Otis Goins died in July of 2001. The car sat in the garage. Eventually it was sold to a man named Sam Ballin. And then in 2006, a man named Rick Lucas bought it from Ballin and brought it back to his shop and started pulling it apart and realized he had no idea what he was actually looking at. Here's what most people don't realize about how race car history gets preserved, or more accurately, how it gets lost. The cars that end up in museums and collections and restoration shops are almost always the ones that came from operations with enough institutional presence to leave a paper trail. Championship-winning cars, factory-backed cars, cars driven by people whose names appeared regularly in the publications that shaped the sport's historical memory. Cars from self-funded regional operations have a different trajectory. They get raced until they can't be raced anymore, and then they go into garages and barns and storage units, and the knowledge of what they were and what they did lives in the memories of the people who were there. And when those people get old and the memories fade or the people themselves are gone, the cars become anonymous. A tube frame chassis and a fiberglass body, and a disassembled nitro engine sitting in a garage in Gary, Indiana tells you nothing about where it came from unless you already know where to look and have the patience to follow the trail wherever it leads. Rick Lucas had both. He started asking questions, and the questions led him to a family in Gary, and eventually to Nelly Goins herself, who was in her mid-60s and had been living in a world that had largely forgotten she ever raced a car. The restoration he undertook was as close to a genuine miracle of preservation as the drag racing world has produced in recent memory. He took the car back to its 1971 Mach 1 Mustang configuration completely and accurately, which required research and sourcing and a level of commitment to getting it right that went well beyond what most restorers bring to a project. And he commissioned Ken Hirata to rebuild the 481 cubic inch Hemi. Hirata was still alive. He still knew the car. He had been the technical resource that made the Nitro transition possible in the first place, and now he was rebuilding the engine that he had originally helped tune for a restoration that would bring the car back to exactly what it had been when Nelly was driving it. His wife Chio and his son David came to the 2015 Gatornationals and reconnected with Nelly after decades apart. The whole thing somehow came back around in a way that feels almost too complete to be real but is documented and confirmed. Lucas also started telling people the story. He posted about it in the Moparts Forum, an online community for Mopar enthusiasts, in January of 2014 when he announced that Nelly was being inducted into the East Coast Drag Times Hall of Fame. His post was direct about what he had found. Very few people had heard of her at that point, himself included before he bought the car, but that had changed. And the post landed in a community that understood exactly what a self-funded family team running a supercharged nitro funny car in the early 1970s actually represented in terms of commitment and knowledge and sheer determination, and the response reflected that understanding. The 2014 Hall of Fame induction was the 13th annual East Coast Drag Times ceremony in Henderson, North Carolina. Nelly was there. Her sister was there. The Conqueror was there. After 30 years of complete obscurity, the car and the woman who drove it were being formally recognized by a community that cared about the history of drag racing beyond the national championship record book. It was a real moment and a meaningful one, but it was still relatively contained within the enthusiast community that follows vintage and historical drag racing closely. The 2015 Gatornationals was when the story broke open for the broader drag racing audience. Lucas brought the restored Conqueror to Gainesville, Florida, and NHRA displayed it in the Hot Rod Junction area where vintage and historic race cars are shown during the event weekend. The Gatornationals is one of the 4 major national events on the NHRA calendar, the ones that carry extra points and extra prestige and draw the largest crowds and the most media attention of any events in the sport outside of the U.S. Nationals in Indianapolis. Putting the Conqueror in the Hot Rod Junction at Gainesville meant tens of thousands of people who had never heard of Nelly Goins were going to walk past the car over the course of the weekend, and many of them were going to stop and ask what they were looking at and get the answer. Nelly came. She sat next to Don Garlits for autograph sessions, and that detail deserves more than a passing mention, because Don Garlits is not a minor figure you put someone next to as a courtesy. Garlits is the patron saint of drag racing history. He has been celebrated continuously and extensively for his entire career. He has museums named after him. He has championships and records and a level of institutional recognition that represents everything the sport's official memory produces when it is working properly. And Nelly Goins, who had been essentially invisible for 30 years despite having run in the same era at competitive speeds in the most extreme class of the same sport, was sitting next to him signing programs while fans lined up to learn why she mattered. She was 75 years old. She also met Antron Brown at the Gatornationals, and this is where it gets really interesting in a way that reframes the entire story from a different angle. Brown had in 2012 become the first African-American driver to win an NHRA professional championship, doing it in Top Fuel, and he is one of the most respected and admired figures in the modern sport. His team is a professional operation in every sense of the word, fully funded, fully staffed, running with the resources that the modern NHRA professional circuit demands. Nelly's reaction to meeting him and seeing his operation is one of the most quietly devastating things in this entire story. She said he was so sweet and so nice, and that he took her inside his hauler and opened a cabinet, and there were 16 pairs of brand new cylinder heads just sitting there ready to go. 16 pairs. And she thought about what they would have given to have 2 extra pairs of brand new heads back in the day. That's not bitterness in her voice when she tells that story. It's not resentment. It's something more precise than either of those things. It's the recognition of a distance so large that it can barely be measured in the same unit. The Goins family had scraped together what they needed to keep one engine running through 6 years of match racing on a budget that required double shifts and a 60-mile daily commute to a munitions plant. Brown's team had 16 pairs of cylinder heads in a cabinet as standard operational inventory. The generational and economic distance between those two realities is not just a difference in resources. It represents what the sport had become in the intervening 4 decades, how completely it had professionalized at the top level, and how thoroughly the self-funded family match racer had ceased to be a viable model for competitive operation in the premier classes. Nelly wasn't looking at what she could have had if things had been different. She was looking at a completely different world that had evolved in directions that the world she raced in couldn't have predicted and wouldn't have recognized. And she was doing it at 75 years old with a kind of clear-eyed equanimity that is genuinely remarkable when you consider what the contrast actually represented in terms of her own history. In 2016, NHRA celebrated the 50th anniversary of the funny car class at the U.S. Nationals in Indianapolis. The U.S. Nationals is the biggest event in the sport, the one that carries the most prestige and the longest history and the deepest connection to what drag racing represents as a competitive institution. And the Conqueror was displayed there as part of the official celebration of the class's history. The car that had sat in a garage in Gary, Indiana for 30 years was now being presented as part of the official historical record of the funny car class at the most important drag racing event in the world. Nelly was recognized. The crowd responded. And for someone who had spent 3 decades in complete obscurity while the sport she had competed in moved on and grew and professionalized around her memory, the moment carried a weight that is hard to fully articulate but easy to understand if you have been paying attention to this story. The institutional recognition that followed the 2015 and 2016 appearances has been steady if belated. The Automotive Hall of Fame in Dearborn, Michigan included her in their exhibit on African Americans' accomplishments and contributions in automotive history. The African American Automotive Association inducted her into their Hall of Fame. The Race Wife Unfiltered podcast covered her story in February of 2023 in a segment specifically focused on Black women in motorsport. Motor City's National Heritage area has featured her story multiple times in 2022 and 2023. For a woman who spent 30 years in complete obscurity, the late recognition has accumulated into something meaningful even if the timing will always carry the asterisk of how long it took to arrive. Now, here's what most people don't realize when they encounter the Nelly Goins story through secondary sources, and this matters for understanding what the story actually is versus what it sometimes gets presented as. One claim that has circulated in some coverage, specifically the assertion that Nelly still holds multiple records that have never been broken, is not accurate. Nelly herself said in her NHRA interview that she never broke any records. She wasn't being falsely modest or deflecting praise she deserved. The match race circuit she competed on didn't generate official sanctioned records the way NHRA national events did. The performance figures associated with the Conqueror, the low 7-second elapsed times and the 215-mile-per-hour top speed, come from the team's own accounts and from contemporaneous observation at match race events, not from official timing books that would support a formal record claim. What she did was extraordinary and documented in the ways that the match race circuit documented things, but conflating competitive performance with official records muddies the story in ways that ultimately don't serve it. The story doesn't need inflation. It's strong enough without it. There are also gaps in the historical record that cannot be papered over with confidence, and being honest about them is part of telling this story correctly. No race results have survived in any publicly accessible archive. No win-loss record exists for the Conqueror's competitive career. The team competed for roughly 6 years on the Midwest match race circuit, and the documentation that would tell you specifically who they raced against on any given weekend and how those races ended simply does not exist in any form that researchers have been able to locate. The Ebony magazine spread from November of 1971 is the only confirmed contemporaneous media coverage from the entire career. No Hot Rod, no Carcraft, no Drag Racing USA, no National Dragster coverage has been located. Her exact sanctioning body affiliation is unclear. She does not appear on NHRA's official list of women licensed for funny car competition, which strongly suggests she was racing under NHRA or independent regional sanction rather than at NHRA-sanctioned events, but that has not been formally confirmed in any source currently available. The number of total races is unknown. The identity of most of the competitors she raced against is unknown. Her life between 1975 and 2006, the 30 years between the Bristol incident and Rick Lucas's restoration, is essentially undocumented beyond the fact of Otis's death in 2001. These gaps matter because the story has to be told honestly, and the honest version of this story does not have a triumphant competitive record at its center. The competitive record is thin in the sense that it cannot be reconstructed with any specificity. The career was short and regional and largely unwatched outside a small Midwestern circuit, and the documentation that would give it the kind of verifiable factual foundation that championship careers have simply was not generated at the time and cannot be retroactively created. None of that changes what happened. What happened was real and significant and worth telling in full. But the story's power does not come from wins, and it does not come from records. It comes from something else entirely, something that is harder to quantify and more durable than either of those things. Nelly Goins said something when she was being honored at the 2015 Gatornationals that cuts directly to what this whole story was actually about at its core. She said that having the car at the Gatornationals was the greatest thing that could ever happen, and that Otis had been gone 14 years, but she knew that he saw it. Think about what that statement contains. A woman who got in a Nitro funny car because her husband couldn't pass the physical, who drove it for 6 years on a regional circuit without a single sponsor, who raised 4 children, who worked as her pit crew on cold garage floors through Indiana winters, who commuted 60 miles each way to help build artillery shells and came home to work on a supercharged Chrysler Hemi, who went 215 miles per hour and then watched the world move on without her for 3 decades. And what she said at the moment of recognition was not about herself. It was about Otis. It was about the man who built the dream and couldn't live inside it the way he wanted to because his body wouldn't allow it, and who died in 2001 still ordering parts from catalogs and reading National Dragster from his bed because the dream never actually ended, it just ran out of time. She also said that when she was first approached about the Hall of Fame induction, she almost turned it down. She almost said no because she never broke any records and didn't feel worthy of all the praise being directed at her. And her daughter told her something that reframed the entire thing. Her daughter said it's not about all of that. You open the door. And then Nelly said this, and I want you to hear it clearly because it is the single most important line in this entire story. She said there is such a thing as getting your roses before you die. That's it. That is the whole thing compressed into one sentence. A woman who spent 30 years in complete obscurity after 6 years of legitimate and extraordinary competition, who never asked for recognition and who almost declined it when it finally arrived because she didn't think she had done enough to deserve it, said that getting her roses before she died was the greatest thing that could have happened. Not the records she didn't break. Not the sponsorships that never came. Not the national events she never ran. The roses. Late. Too late for Otis, who dreamed it and built it and funded it and couldn't drive it and died before anyone outside their immediate circle knew what they had done together. But not too late for Nelly. Here's the thing about what Nelly Goins actually was, and I want to be precise about this because the story deserves precision. She was not primarily a drag racer. She was a woman from Gary, Indiana, who went to work at a munitions plant and supervised the assembly of howitzer shells during a war and raised 4 children and worked double shifts and drove 60 miles each way and came home to a garage where a Nitro funny car was being built by her husband, who loved the sport too much to let his diabetes be the end of it. She got in the car because he asked her to and because she trusted him and because the family dream needed someone to drive and she was the one available. She drove it at 215 miles per hour for 6 years without a single corporate dollar behind her, and with her own children handing her equipment in the pit. And when it was over, she didn't talk about it much for 30 years, because there wasn't really anyone asking. Now you might be thinking that the story of someone who competed regionally without winning championships, and without official records, and without national coverage, is maybe a smaller story than it's being presented as here. And I want to address that directly because it gets at something fundamental about how we decide which stories matter in motorsport history. The stories that get told and retold and institutionally preserved are almost always the stories that generated documentation at the time they were happening. Championships produce record book. Sponsors produce media coverage. National events produce timing records and photographs, and the kind of contemporaneous documentation that historians can work with 40 years later. The match race world produced almost none of that. And so the history of drag racing as it is commonly understood is substantially the history of the NHRA national circuit and the people who competed on it, with everything else existing in a kind of permanent historical shadow where real things happen to real people, and those things are nonetheless almost impossible to verify or reconstruct. Nelly Goins spent 30 years in that shadow. And what brought her out of it was not an institutional decision to do better or a sponsorship finally materializing or a championship that forced the record books to acknowledge her. It was a guy in a shop who bought an old race car and started asking questions and had the patience to follow the trail wherever it led. Rick Lucas found a tube frame chassis and a disassembled Nitro engine and a Chevrolet Monza body that didn't belong to the original car, and he turned it back into the 1971 Mach 1 Mustang Conqueror that Nelly had driven at US 30 Dragway and Great Lakes Dragway and Tri-State Raceway and Bristol Dragway and every other track on the Midwest match race circuit during the years when the family dream was actually running. He got Ken Hirata to rebuild the engine. Hirata rebuilt it the same way he had tuned it the first time around, with the knowledge and the hands of someone who had been there from the beginning of the Nitro chapter of the car's life. And when it was done, the car looked and ran as it had when Nelly was driving it, which means the physical object that embodies the Goins family's 6-year commitment to their shared dream still exists in the world and has been seen by tens of thousands of people at major NHRA events who would otherwise have had no way of knowing this story. This is where it gets really interesting in terms of what the Conqueror's second life actually represents. The car has been displayed at the Gatornationals and at the US Nationals and at the 50th anniversary celebration of the funny car class. It has been seen by audiences that include professional drivers and longtime fans and people who are encountering drag racing history for the first time. and every time someone stops in front of it and asks what it is, the answer they get is the story of Otis and Nelly Goins and 4 kids on cold garage floors in Gary, Indiana, and a munitions plant commute and a nitro engine that scared the neighbors during Sunday services and 215 miles per hour on the Midwest match race circuit without a single sponsor and 30 years of silence followed by roses. That's what the car carries now. Not just its own history but the obligation to communicate that history to people who would never have encountered it otherwise. The Lee Austin chassis that was fitted to Nelly's measurements in February of 1970, while it was still sitting on the jig. The 481 cubic inch Chrysler Hemi rebuilt by Ken Hirata for the second time in his life with the same knowledge he brought to it the first time. The fiberglass Mustang Mach 1 body that replaced the Challenger and became the configuration the car is remembered in. The Goins and Goins Conqueror, built with U.S. steel money and munitions plant paychecks and the labor of a family that worked through Indiana winters because the dream needed to keep going. That car now sits in the official history of the funny car class at the most prestigious drag racing events in the world. Not because it won championship, not because it had sponsors, not because it ran nationals, but because a woman who got in it because her husband couldn't went 215 miles per hour on Nitro in the early 1970s as the first African-American woman ever to drive a funny car at that level, and because the car survived long enough for someone to find it and ask the right questions. And because Nelly Goins was still alive at 75 to sit next to Don Garlits and sign programs and tell people about 16 pairs of cylinder heads in a cabinet and what they would have given for 2 extra pairs back in the day. Here's what most people don't realize when they think about legacy in motorsport. Legacy is not primarily about what you won. It is about what you made possible by doing what you did when you did it. Nelly Goins did not win a championship. She did not set an official record. She did not secure a sponsorship or run a national event or appear in Hot Rod magazine or get her name in the NHRA record book. What she did was get in a nitro funny car as a black woman in 1969 when the institutional forces arrayed against that specific combination of identities were explicit and documented and backed by the authority of the sanctioning bodies that controlled access to competition. She did it on her own family's money. She did it without asking for permission from anyone who wasn't already on her side. She did it for 6 years at speeds that demanded to be taken seriously regardless of any other context. And she did it while raising 4 children and working double shifts and commuting 60 miles each way to a munitions plant and lying on cold concrete in a Gary garage in January because the car needed to be ready for the next season. The door her daughter told her she had opened was not a metaphor. It was a real door into a space that had been actively closed to people who looked like Nelly Goins, and she went through it anyway. And the fact that the world didn't notice for 30 years does not change what it meant that she went through it. Recognition delayed is not recognition denied, though it is recognition diminished, and the diminishment is real and should be acknowledged honestly rather than papered over with the warmth of the belated celebration. Otis never got his roses. He died in 2001 with the car in the garage, and the Monza body on the chassis, and the dream still alive in the future tense, where it had lived since Bristol. That is the part of this story that doesn't resolve neatly and shouldn't be made to resolve neatly, because the honest version of what happened to the Goins family includes the fact that the recognition came too late for the man who built it all and who deserved to see the Conqueror at the Gatornationals just as much as Nelly did. What we can say is that the car exists. The restoration is complete and accurate. The story is now part of the official record of the funny car class in a way that it wasn't before Rick Lucas started asking questions in 2006. Nelly Goins got her roses. She sat next to Don Garlits at 75 years old, and she knew that Otis saw it. And somewhere in a shop in the Mid-Atlantic region, a tube-frame chassis built by Lee Austin in 1970 around the measurements of a woman from Gary, Indiana, carries all of that forward into every event it attends and every conversation it starts and every person who stops in front of it and asks what they're looking at and gets the answer. That is what legacy actually looks like when it survives the silence. That is the Goins and Goins Conqueror. That is Nelly Goins. And that is why it still matters now.